I dropped out of college and now I'm the enemy of my parents because my brother got 2 degrees, but their mouths shut quickly when I showed them how much I earn. When I was 19, I became public enemy number 1 in my own family. I guess that's what happens when you don't live up to the golden standard set by your older brother. Jake the Precious Johnson's son was on his way to earning 2 degrees, while I was apparently a lazy bum, who dared to dream outside the rigid mold my parents had created for me. But let me tell you, the day I packed up and left home, my parents were more relieved than angry. They'd already decided that their household was a place of rules and respect, which loosely translates to, do everything we say or you're not welcome here. I didn't yell or argue. I just calmly packed up my clothes, my laptop, and what little money I had. Before I left, I looked them both in the eye and said, "You might want to see a specialist about whatever's going on in your heads, because kicking your kid out because he's not a clone of his brother? That's unhinged." Jake stood there awkwardly, probably torn between stepping in or keeping his halo intact. I told him, "Don't bother. You're the cheap model of the perfect son anyway. Stick with it." I could tell he didn't know whether to be offended or relieved. My parents? They just told me to get out. So I did. I didn't have a big plan or a lot of savings. I didn't drop out because I didn't want to learn. I dropped out because I had been into crypto for 2 years. I believed in it, even if no one else did. And frankly, there was something liberating about leaving that stifling house, even if it meant spending the first week in a cheap hotel. From that hotel room, I redoubled my efforts. I worked day and night on deals, market research, and networking with other people in the industry. By the end of the second month, I had made $20,000. Not life-changing yet, but it was enough to get my own place, pay the bills, and keep the momentum going. I didn't need their permission, but I admit I kept receipts. One day I would prove them wrong. It wasn't easy. While Jake played the obedient son, got his degree, and rode the wave of family approval, I did it alone. No support, no pats on the back, just me and my laptop. And every time I thought about going back to them, I heard my dad's voice. "If you don't do what we say, you don't belong in this house." Fine. I didn't belong. At least not until I did it on my own terms. The first few months on my own were a blur of exhaustion and focus. I rented a tiny one-bedroom apartment, not much bigger than the hotel room I'd been staying in, but at least it was mine. I didn't live lavishly by any means. Instant ramen and black coffee were the staples, but I was determined to make it work. Meanwhile, my parents loved to rub Jake's accomplishments in my face whenever they got the chance. I'd get the occasional passive-aggressive text. "Jake just got a prestigious internship. Isn't it great when kids work hard?" Or, "Your brother's professor says he's one of the brightest students they've ever had." I ignored all of this. I didn't have time to dwell on the comparisons when I was too busy proving to myself that I hadn't made a huge mistake. Crypto wasn't an overnight success for me. I'd been dabbling in it since I was 17, but now it was my full-time focus. And for every win, there were losses. I made some stupid trades early on that cost me more than I'd like to admit, but I learned quickly. When I hit my first $20,000 in profits, I started to breathe a little easier. I bought a used car for $10,000, nothing fancy, but it was reliable. And for the first time, I felt like I was on solid ground. My work was starting to pay off in a bigger way, and I knew it wasn't just luck. It was the result of hours and hours of toiling while everyone else assumed I was throwing my life away. The first time I visited my parents after I left, I could tell they weren't sure what to expect. My dad sat in his usual spot at the head of the table, reading the paper like it was still 1995. My mother was in the kitchen, cooking dinner. Jake was there, too, looking his usual polished self, fresh haircut, pressed shirt, probably ready to remind everyone how he single-handedly kept the Johnson name in good standing. They asked me how I'd been, though I could tell they weren't really interested in the answer. I decided to throw them a curveball. I pulled out my phone and showed them my income over the past few months. It wasn't bragging, it was a silent mic drop. Their mouths literally dropped open. My dad asked, "Wait, this is real?" Jake sat there trying to act unimpressed, but I could see the gears turning in his head. My mom was quick to switch tones, going from dismissive to overly sweet in a matter of seconds. "That's wonderful, honey! We always knew you'd figure it out." "Sure you did." Then came the kicker. My dad leaned back in his chair and said, "Well, now that you're doing so well, maybe you can help us out a little. Your brother's rent is expensive, and it's been hard to keep up." I almost laughed out loud. After all these years of being told I wasn't good enough, now they wanted my help? I looked at Jake, who suddenly looked like he wanted to disappear into his seat. I told them I'd think about it, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to prove a point. They'd written me off as the family's failure, but here I was, the so-called loser, now in a position to help them. It wasn't about the money, it was about reminding them that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have it all figured out. I didn't immediately agree to help them. I told them I'd think about it and left it at that. After dinner, I got back in my car, drove home, and couldn't help but laugh. The irony of it all was almost too much to bear. For years they'd looked down on me. Now I was their best chance to get out of a financial mess they'd never even mentioned. The next day, Jake texted me. He almost never reached out unless it was to brag about his latest accomplishment, so I was curious. He wanted to get coffee and talk. I agreed, thinking it would be interesting to hear what he had to say. At the coffee shop, Jake got right to the point. "I need to ask you something," he said, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "Can you help me with the rent?" "Just for a few months." I raised an eyebrow. "Aren't Mom and Dad already covering it?" He hesitated before admitting, "Not exactly. They've been struggling for a while. They didn't want to tell you, but they had to take out a second mortgage a year ago to keep up with my tuition and living expenses." This was news to me. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "So let me get this straight. They've been bending over backwards to support you, even if it means going into debt, while telling me I'm the disappointment?" Jake didn't argue. He just looked down at his coffee, obviously embarrassed. "I didn't know things were that bad until recently," he admitted. I should have been angry, but instead I felt sorry for him. It wasn't his fault that our parents had put him on this ridiculous pedestal. He was just playing the role they'd forced on him. Still, I couldn't resist taking a jab at him. "Looks like being the golden child isn't all it's cracked up to be, huh?" Jake grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Look, I get it. They treated you like crap. But I'm asking you as your brother, can you help?" I told him I'd think about it. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. A week later, things took an even stranger turn. My mom called me, sounding desperate. She said my dad had been laid off from his job. Apparently, the company was downsizing, and after 25 years of loyalty, they'd decided he was expendable. I wasn't sure how to feel. On the one hand, I felt bad for my dad. Losing your job like that has to sting. On the other hand, it felt like karma. This was the same man who told me, "If you don't follow the plan, you'll never make it." Now he was unemployed and the plan had clearly failed him. My mother started crying on the phone, saying they didn't know how they were going to keep the house. "We need your help," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, can you come over? We need to talk." So I went. But I wasn't just going to hand them a blank check and call it a day. I had some things I needed to get off my chest. When I walked into the house, the mood was tense. My dad was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills. My mom was pacing, and Jake was leaning against the counter, looking like he wanted to be anywhere but there. I sat down and said, "Okay, let's talk. What's going on?" My dad started to explain the situation, but halfway through he stopped and looked at me. "I don't know how we got into this mess," he said. "We did everything right. We worked hard, saved, made sure our kids got the best education. And now look at us." I couldn't help myself. "Maybe because you're doing everything right didn't include listening to me when I told you crypto was a real opportunity," I said. "Instead, you laughed at me and kicked me out." My mother started to protest, but I held up my hand. I'm not saying this to rub it in. I'm saying it because maybe it's time you stopped treating me like the family failure. I worked my ass off to get where I am, and I did it without your support. So if you want my help, fine. But you're going to acknowledge that I'm not a failure. My dad looked like he was going to argue, but then he just nodded. All right, he said quietly. You're not a failure. That was unexpected. For the first time in my life, I saw my father as a human being. Not the authority figure who always knew best, but a guy who was scared and unsure of what to do next. Good, I said. Now let's figure out how to fix this mess. I agreed to help, but on my terms. I wasn't about to become the family's piggy bank just because their golden plan fell apart. So I laid it all out for them. I will pay the mortgage for 3 months, I said, but you have to start making changes. That means no more hiding things, no more pretending everything is perfect. My dad balked at the terms, but my mom nodded quickly. Jake just looked relieved. I didn't let them off easy, though. And Jake, maybe it's time for you to start pulling your weight, too. You're not a kid anymore. You can't keep relying on them to finance your life. That hit a nerve. Jake looked like he was going to argue, but then he just sighed. You're right, he said quietly. For the next few weeks I worked out a plan with them. I paid the most pressing bills, but I made it clear that this was only temporary. My dad started looking for work, although it was clear that his confidence had taken a hit. My mother took a part-time job at a local boutique to help with expenses. And Jake? He got a part-time job tutoring students, which was honestly the most responsibility he'd taken on in years. I thought things were finally settling down, but then something unexpected happened. One day I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It turned out to be one of Jake's professors. Apparently, Jake had bragged about my success during a tutoring session, and the professor wanted to know if I'd be willing to give a talk to his class about crypto and entrepreneurship. At first I thought it was a joke. Me? Teaching at the same college I dropped out of? But the professor insisted, saying the students would benefit from hearing about a non-traditional success story. I almost said no, but then I thought, why not? It would be a chance to show that success doesn't always come from following the rules. When I told my family, their reactions were priceless. My mom looked like she was going to cry, my dad gave me an awkward pat on the back, and Jake mumbled something about how he'd never live this down. The day of the presentation was surreal. I walked into a packed auditorium feeling like a fraud. But once I started speaking, everything clicked. I told them about my journey, the risks, the failures, the moments when I thought I'd made the worst mistake of my life. I didn't sugarcoat anything. At the end, the room was buzzing with questions. One student asked, "Do you think dropping out was worth it?" I paused, trying to think of an answer. It wasn't about dropping out, I said. It was about betting on myself. You don't have to drop out to do that. But if you're going to take a chance, make sure it's one you're willing to work your ass off to make pay off. The applause at the end was loud enough to make me a little emotional, not that I'd ever admit it. My phone exploded with messages that night. Some were from students thanking me for the talk, but the one that stood out was from my dad. It was short, just a few words. "I'm proud of you, son." I stared at it for a long time, not sure how to feel. My dad wasn't the type to throw out compliments, so I knew he hadn't written it lightly. The funny thing is, I didn't feel the need to respond. The message wasn't just for me, it was for him, too. A way to admit that maybe he'd been wrong. And honestly, that was enough. I thought the talk would be the culmination of my vindication arc. But life had other plans. A few weeks after the talk, I got a call from Jake. He sounded weird, like he wasn't sure he should be calling me at all. "What's up?" I asked, trying not to sound too annoyed. Jake wasn't exactly the type to call unless he needed something. He hesitated, then said, "Well, I've been thinking about making a change." That caught me off guard. "What kind of change?" "I'm thinking about dropping one of my degrees," he said. "Or maybe both." I almost choked. "Wait, what? You're the one living the dream. Why would you drop out now? It's not my dream, he said softly. For a second I didn't know what to say. Jake had spent his whole life chasing the version of success our parents had set for him. Hearing him admit that he didn't want that anymore was like watching a glitch in the Matrix. All right, I finally said. What are you going to do instead? He sighed. I don't know. I just know I hate what I'm doing. I feel like I'm living someone else's life. I couldn't help but laugh a little. Welcome to my world, I said. Jake didn't laugh, but he didn't hang up either. Instead, he asked, how did you know what you wanted to do? I mean, with crypto and all? I thought for a minute. I didn't, I said honestly. I just knew what I didn't want to do, and I figured out the rest along the way. Jake was silent for a long time after that. I think I need to talk to Mom and Dad about this, he said finally. Good luck with that, I said, trying not to sound bitter. They're not exactly open-minded when it comes to life plans. I know, he said, but I can't keep doing this. A week later, I received a frantic phone call from my mother. Apparently, Jake had dropped the bombshell at dinner, and it had not gone well. My dad was furious, my mom was crying, and Jake had stormed out of the house. Can you talk to him? My mother pleaded. He won't return our calls. I debated whether or not to get involved. Jake wasn't a kid anymore. He could take care of himself. But something about the desperation in my mother's voice got to me. I found Jake at a bar near campus, sipping a drink and looking more miserable than I'd ever seen him. Rough night? I asked, sliding onto the stool next to him. You could say that, he muttered. We sat in silence for a while, and then he said, They don't get it. They think I'm throwing it all away. Dad called me ungrateful, said I'm wasting all the sacrifices they made for me. That sounds familiar, I said dryly. Jake actually managed a small smile at that. How did you handle it? I left, I said simply. It wasn't easy, but I knew I couldn't live my life for them. And neither could you. We talked for hours that night, and for the first time I saw a side of Jake I hadn't seen before. He wasn't the perfect son, or the golden child, or the one with all the answers. He was just a guy trying to figure out his life, just like the rest of us. At the end of the night, I told him, whatever you decide to do, just make sure it's what you want. Not what they want, not what I think, but what you really want. Jake nodded, and for the first time in a long time, he looked like he didn't have the weight of the world on his shoulders. The next morning I got a text message from him. Thanks for last night. I think I know what I have to do now. A month after Jake and I talked, things started to turn around. He dropped one of his majors and switched to something he actually cared about: urban planning. It surprised me at first, but seeing him passionate about it made sense. What was even more surprising was that our parents didn't completely lose it. My mom softened over time, and even my dad seemed to accept that Jake's decision wasn't the end of the world. Meanwhile, my business continued to grow. I moved into a better apartment, bought a car I actually loved, and started living the life I'd worked so hard for. With things finally stable, I decided to have my family over for dinner. When they arrived, they looked around my apartment in awe. My mom kept saying how proud she was, my dad nodded more than he spoke, and Jake gave me a quiet, approving grin. At dinner, my dad even raised his glass and admitted, "You proved me wrong, and I'm proud of you." It was weird to hear that, but in a good way. Afterwards, Jake pulled me aside and said, "I used to be jealous of you. You were always doing your own thing. I wish I'd had the guts to do it sooner." "You're doing it now," I told him. "That's what matters." As they left that night, I realized that we'd all changed. We weren't perfect, but for the first time it felt like we were on the same side. I'd bet on myself and won, and now my family finally saw it, too. A month after Jake and I talked, things started to turn around. He dropped one of his degrees and switched to something he actually cared about: urban planning. It surprised me at first, but seeing him passionate about it made sense. What was even more surprising was that our parents didn't completely lose it. My mom softened over time, and even my dad seemed to accept that Jake's decision wasn't the end of the world. Meanwhile, my business continued to grow. I moved into a better apartment, bought a car I actually loved, and started living the life I'd worked so hard for. With things finally stable, I decided to have my family over for dinner. When they arrived, they looked around my apartment in awe. My mom kept saying how proud she was, my dad nodded more than he spoke, and Jake gave me a quiet, approving grin. At dinner, my dad even raised his glass and admitted, "You proved me wrong, and I'm proud of you." It was weird to hear that, but in a good way. Afterwards, Jake pulled me aside and said, "I used to be jealous of you. You were always doing your own thing. I wish I'd had the guts to do it sooner. You're doing it now." I told him. That's what matters. As they left that night, I realized that we'd all changed. We weren't perfect, but for the first time it felt like we were on the same side. I bet on myself and won, and now my family finally saw it, too. A week later, I got a text from Jake. "Thanks for everything. You've inspired me more than you know." I stared at it for a while and smiled. For years I had been the outcast, the failure, the one who didn't fit in. Now my family looked at me differently. And maybe, just maybe, we'd all ended up exactly where we needed to be.